In the time when lotus petals first learned to unfold upon still waters, there lived a merchant named Kamalesh, whose restless mind churned like monsoon clouds. Each night, sleep eluded him, as his thoughts scattered like autumn leaves in an endless wind. His days were filled with the weight of countless worries, each one multiplying like shadows at sunset. Kamalesh had heard whispers of a sage who dwelt beyond the valley of 7 streams, a teacher whose words could calm even the most turbulent heart. With nothing but hope, as his companion Kamalesh set forth on the winding path that led through groves of ancient sal trees, their branches swaying in silent meditation. The sage known only as Niranjan sat beneath a tree whose roots had drunk deeply from the earth for countless seasons. His presence was like still water, reflecting the moon, peaceful yet profound. When Kamalesh approached the sage's eyes, opened slowly as if awakening from a dream that contained all the wisdom of ages past. "Teacher," Kamalesh began, his voice heavy with the burden of sleepless nights. "My mind knows no rest. Thoughts arise like waves in an endless ocean, each one carrying me further from peace. How can one find stillness when the world itself seems to spin without cease?" Niranjan smiled, a gentle expression that seemed to hold the warmth of countless dawns. He gestured toward a nearby pond where water lilies floated serenely, their petals closed in evening's embrace. "Tell me, friend Kamalesh, what do you see when you observe these flowers?" Kamalesh looked upon the lilies, their white petals soft as whispered prayers. "I see beauty, master, and stillness. They rest upon the water as if the very surface were their natural home." "Look deeper," Niranjan suggested, his voice carrying the rhythm of gentle rain. "See how the water beneath moves with countless currents, how fish swim in the depths, how the wind creates ripples across the surface. Yet the lilies remain undisturbed, neither fighting the movement nor being carried away by it." As twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and violet, Niranjan continued his teaching. "Your mind, dear Kamalesh, is like this pond. Thoughts arise and pass away. Like the fish below, emotions create ripples, like the wind above. Yet your true nature remains as peaceful as these lilies. The secret is not to stop the movement, but to rest in your natural stillness." Kamalesh felt something shift within him, like a door opening in a house he had never known existed. But how does one learn this resting, this floating upon the waters of consciousness, without being swept away? The sage reached into the folds of his simple robe and withdrew a single lotus seed, small and dark as a night sky. Once there was a seed much like this one. It fell into the deepest, muddiest part of a vast lake, where no sunlight could reach, and where the water was thick with silt and debris. For many seasons it lay in this darkness, neither growing nor dying, simply being. Niranjan's words flowed like a gentle stream, carrying Kamalesh deeper into a state of peaceful attention. The seed did not struggle against the mud, nor did it long for the surface. It simply remained present to its own nature, trusting in the wisdom that had been placed within it since the beginning of time. Slowly, very slowly, it began to extend a tender shoot upward through the dark waters. Day by day, season by season, the shoot grew stronger, moving through layers of water that grew clearer as it ascended. It did not rush, for it knew that each moment of growth was perfect in itself. It did not fear the darkness below, for it had learned that even in the deepest mud, life could flourish. The evening air grew soft around them, filled with the fragrance of jasmine and the distant sound of temple bells. Kamalesh found his breathing deepening naturally, his shoulders releasing tension he had carried for countless days. Finally, Niranjan continued, the shoot reached the surface, and in one perfect moment, it bloomed into a lotus of extraordinary beauty. Its petals gleamed like fresh snow in moonlight, and its fragrance blessed all who passed near. But here is the wonder friend, Kamalesh. The lotus had never left the mud. Even as it bloomed in radiant beauty, its roots remained anchored in the very darkness from which it had emerged. Kamalesh felt tears gathering at the corners of his eyes, though he could not say why. The sage's words seemed to touch something ancient within him, a remembering that went beyond thought. Your restless mind, Niranjan said softly, is the mud from which your own lotus may bloom. Each worried thought, each anxious moment is not an obstacle to peace, but the very substance from which peace emerges. You need not escape your thoughts, dear friend. You need only learn to rest in your own depths, while allowing your natural wisdom to grow toward the light. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, each one a distant reminder of the vastness that held all things in gentle embrace. Kamalesh sat in silence, feeling something he had not experienced in many months, a deep natural tiredness that promised genuine rest. As dawn painted the horizon with fingers of gold and rose, Kamalesh found himself walking deeper into the forest, his heart lighter than it had been in countless seasons. The sage Niranjan had spoken of other seekers who dwelt in these ancient woods, each one carrying their own bundle of sorrows toward the light of understanding. Through morning mist that clung to the earth like gentle prayers, Kamalesh came upon a clearing where a young woman sat, weaving baskets from river reeds. Her name was Tushara, and her fingers moved with the grace of wind through grass, yet her eyes held the shadow of deep sadness. Tushara had once been a celebrated dancer in the court of a great king, her movements flowing like water over stones, her grace admired by nobles and commoners alike. But a terrible accident had left her unable to dance, and with the loss of her art, she felt she had lost herself entirely. Now she lived in solitude, creating beautiful baskets that no one would buy, her heart heavy with the weight of dreams that seemed forever broken. "Sister," Kamalesh called gently as he approached, remembering the kindness that Niranjan had shown him. "Your baskets are works of wonder. Each one seems to hold the essence of flowing water itself." Tushara looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Once I created beauty with my whole being," she whispered, her voice carrying the melody of distant rain. "Now I can only make these simple things, useful perhaps, but lacking the magic that once flowed through me like sacred fire." As they sat together in the dappled shade, Tushara shared her story, each word falling like petals from a tree that had known both spring and winter. She spoke of nights when she lay awake, her body remembering movements it could no longer make, her spirit aching for the expression that had once been as natural as breathing. From the depths of the forest came a sound that caused both travelers to turn their heads in wonder. An old man approached his steps, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth itself. This was Vasudev, a drummer whose hands had once brought joy to countless festivals, but who now walked with the slow gait of one whose music had been silenced by the passing of years. Vasudev's drums had been his voice, his language, his prayer to the divine, but arthritis had gnarled his fingers like ancient roots, and the rhythms that had once poured from his soul now remained trapped within, creating a silence that felt deeper than any sound he had ever made. "I have been listening to your conversation," Vasudev said, his voice carrying the resonance of years spent in contemplation. "I too know the sorrow of art that can no longer find expression. My hands once spoke in rhythms that made children dance, and elders remember their youth. Now they can barely hold these walking sticks that support my journey." The three sat together in a triangle of shared understanding, each one carrying the weight of creative gifts that seemed lost to the passage of time and the challenges of circumstance. The forest around them breathed with ancient wisdom, and in that breathing, they began to sense a presence that transcended their individual sorrows. Through the rustling leaves came another figure, a woman whose bearing suggested both great age and timeless youth. She moved with the fluid grace of water finding its natural course, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of mountains and the gentleness of morning dew. "I am Akshara," she said, settling beside them, as if she had always been part of their circle. "I have been watching your gathering, and I see 3 souls who believe they have lost their greatest treasures. But tell me, dear ones, can the river truly lose its ability to flow?" Tushara raised her eyes, finding in Akshara's gaze a depth that seemed to hold all the compassion of the universe. "But teacher, how can the river flow when its banks have been forever changed? My body no longer responds to the music in my heart. The dance that once lived in every cell of my being has become a memory that haunts rather than heals." Akshara smiled with the warmth of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Long ago, in a valley much like this one, there lived a master craftsman named Chitragupta. He was renowned throughout the land for creating the most exquisite sculptures, each one seeming to breathe with life itself. Kings and merchants traveled great distances to commission his work, and his fame spread like fragrance from a garden in full bloom. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy above, creating patterns of gold and shadow that danced across the forest floor as Akshara continued her tale. For 40 years, Chitragupta carved with hands so skilled they seemed guided by divine inspiration. His workshop was filled with marble figures so lifelike that visitors would pause expecting them to speak or move. But then, like winter arriving without warning, illness came to his hands, making them shake so violently that he could no longer hold his carving tools. Vasudev leaned forward, his weathered face reflecting the pain of recognition. "What became of him, teacher? Did his art die with the stillness of his hands?" "Ah," Akshara replied, her eyes twinkling with the light of stars reflected in still water. "That is where the story becomes wonderful. Chitragupta fell into despair for many months, believing that without his ability to carve, he was nothing more than a shadow of his former self. He would sit in his workshop, surrounded by his tools, weeping for the creations that would never come to be. A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them, and somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang, once its note hanging in the air, like a question waiting for an answer. One day, Akshara continued, a young apprentice came to Chitragupta's workshop, seeking to learn the master's art. When he saw the great sculptor sitting in despair, the young man asked, "Master, will you not teach me to see as you see? Your hands may shake, but surely your eyes still hold the wisdom of decades." Tushara felt something stirring within her chest, like the first movement of a sleeping bird awakening to dawn. What did the master do? Chitragupta looked up at the eager face of the young apprentice, and for the first time in months, he truly saw. He realized that his greatest gift had never been in his hands alone, but in his ability to perceive the hidden beauty within rough stone, to envision the form that waited to be revealed. His shaking hands could no longer carve, but his seeing heart could guide another's steady ones. The wisdom of the story began to settle into the hearts of the 3 listeners like seeds finding fertile ground. Akshara's voice grew softer, more intimate, as if she were sharing a secret that had been kept safe for generations. From that day forward, Chitragupta became the greatest teacher of sculpture the world had ever known. His students, guided by his vision and wisdom, created works of even greater beauty than he had made with his own hands. The master discovered that art does not live in the instrument alone, but in the consciousness that perceives and creates. His gift had not been lost. It had simply found a new way to flow into the world. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold, the three seekers sat in profound silence. Each one felt something shifting within, like ice beginning to melt in the warmth of spring's first touch. Kamalesh, remembering his conversation with Niranjan, spoke first. Perhaps what we call loss is simply transformation wearing an unfamiliar face. Tushara nodded slowly, her hands moving to touch her heart. The dance still lives here, she whispered. Perhaps it seeks new ways to move through the world. Vasudev smiled, the first genuine expression of joy they had seen cross his weathered features. The rhythm continues, in every heartbeat, every breath. Maybe my music was never meant to end, only to find new instruments through which to play. Akshara rose gracefully, her presence beginning to fade like mist in morning sunlight. Remember, dear ones, she said, her voice now seeming to come from the very air around them. The essence of who you are cannot be diminished by the changing of forms. Your gifts are as eternal as the stars, seeking always new ways to shine their light into a world that desperately needs their illumination. As night settled over the forest like a gentle blanket, the three companions found themselves naturally drawn into a peaceful rest, their hearts finally understanding that some treasures can never truly be lost, only transformed into new expressions of their eternal beauty. When morning light filtered through the canopy, like liquid amber, the three companions found themselves naturally drawn to continue their journey together. The forest path wound deeper into territories where ancient trees stood like silent guardians of forgotten wisdom, their branches interwoven in patterns that seemed to hold the secrets of countless generations. Along this sacred way, they encountered a figure unlike any they had seen before. Sitting beside a crystal-clear stream was a woman whose hair had turned silver as moonlight, yet whose face held the serene beauty of one who had found peace with the passage of time. She was known as Chandrika, and she spent her days here offering water to thirsty travelers, her presence as refreshing as the stream itself. But Chandrika carried within her heart a burden that had grown heavier with each passing season. She had once been a mother to 7 children, each one a universe of love and laughter that had filled her days with purpose and joy. One by one, through illness, accident, and the natural course of long lives, fully lived, all her children had departed from this world, leaving her alone with memories that felt both precious and unbearably painful. "Welcome, travelers," Chandrika said, her voice carrying the gentle authority of one who had learned to find grace in the midst of profound loss. "The stream runs clear and cool today. Please drink deeply and rest your feet before continuing on your path." As they accepted her hospitality, Tushara noticed the deep wells of sorrow that seemed to flow beneath Chandrika's calm exterior. "Sister," she said gently, "we are learning about the transformation of gifts and the eternal nature of what we love. May we sit with you and share what we have discovered." Chandrika's composure wavered slightly like the surface of still water touched by a falling leaf. "I fear my story is one of endings rather than transformations," she whispered. "I have loved with the fullness of my being, and now I am empty, a vessel that once held the most precious treasures imaginable, now containing only echoes of what was." From the depths of the forest came a sound that drew their attention, the soft footsteps of someone approaching with the measured gait of deep contemplation. The figure that emerged from the green shadows was a man whose bearing suggested both great strength and profound gentleness. This was Mahendra, a warrior who had once commanded armies and won battles that changed the course of kingdoms. But Mahendra's victories had come at a terrible cost. In his final campaign, He had been forced to make decisions that saved thousands of lives while sacrificing hundreds of others. The weight of those choices had eventually broken something within him, leaving him unable to find peace either in action or in rest. He had abandoned his position and now wandered the forest paths, seeking some form of redemption that seemed forever beyond his reach. "I could not help but overhear your conversation," Mahendra said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of one accustomed to command yet softened by years of introspection. "I too know the pain of loving something so deeply that its loss feels like the end of meaning itself. For me, it was not people, but the ideal of protecting life itself. When I discovered that my protection required the taking of other lives, I lost the ability to see myself as anything other than a contradiction walking in human form." The four souls sat in a circle beside the singing stream, each one carrying a different form of the same essential wound, the belief that what they had lost was irreplaceable, that their deepest purposes had been severed from them by circumstances beyond their control. As the day progressed toward its zenith, the sound of approaching footsteps once again drew their attention. This time the figure who emerged from the forest depths moved with the effortless grace of one who had found harmony with every step. She was ancient beyond measure, yet her eyes sparkled with the curiosity of a child discovering the world for the first time. "I am Saraswati," she said, settling among them as naturally as water finding its level. "I have been walking these paths since before memory began, and I have heard the echoes of your gathering carried on the wind. Each of you speaks of love that has been lost, of purposes that have been broken, of meanings that have been taken away. But tell me, dear ones, can the sun truly lose its ability to give light?" Chandrika lifted her head, meeting the ancient woman's gaze with eyes that held decades of tears. "But honored teacher, the sun shines upon all things equally. My love was specific, particular, irreplaceable. My children were not interchangeable lights in the sky, but unique souls whose absence has left specific holes in the fabric of my being." Saraswati nodded, with the deep understanding of one who had witnessed countless cycles of joy and sorrow, birth and death, creation and dissolution. "Your love was indeed specific and irreplaceable," she agreed. "But let me share with you a story that has been told in these forests for more generations than the trees can count." The afternoon air grew still around them, as if the very forest were leaning in to listen. Even the stream seemed to quiet, its bubbling voice creating a space of perfect attention for the wisdom that was about to unfold. "Long ago," Saraswati began, "there lived a gardener named Vaidyanath who tended the most beautiful garden anyone had ever seen. For 30 years he poured his heart into this sacred space, nurturing each plant with the devotion of a parent caring for a beloved child. His roses bloomed with colors that had no names. His fruit trees bore harvests that fed entire villages, and his flower beds created patterns of such beauty that people would journey from distant lands just to walk among them." Mahendra found himself leaning forward, drawn by something in the old woman's voice that spoke to the deepest places of his warrior's heart. What happened to this garden teacher? Did it too face loss and destruction? "Indeed it did," Saraswati replied, her voice carrying both the sadness of truth and the promise of something beyond tragedy. "A great drought came to the land, lasting for 7 years. Rivers dried to dust, wells ran empty, and the sky withheld its rain as if the very heavens had forgotten how to weep. One by one, Vaidyanath watched his precious plants wither and die despite his desperate efforts to save them." Chandrika felt tears beginning to flow, recognizing in the gardener's story the echo of her own experience of watching what she loved most slip away beyond her power to protect or preserve. For months after the last plant had died, Saraswati continued, Vaidyanath sat in his empty garden surrounded by the dust of what had once been paradise. He cursed the heavens, he cursed the drought, and most of all, he cursed himself for his inability to save what he had loved more than his own life. He believed that his purpose had died with his plants, that he was nothing more than a failed guardian of beauty that would never return. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the stream with ribbons of gold and crimson. In this natural cathedral of light and shadow, the ancient teacher's words seemed to take on a life of their own, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the listeners' hearts. But then, Saraswati said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, something extraordinary happened. As Vaidyanath sat in his grief, he began to notice that the wind was carrying something across his barren land. At first, he paid no attention, lost as he was in his sorrow, but gradually he realized that the wind was carrying seeds from his beloved plants that had been scattered in their final moments of life. Tushara gasped softly, her dancer's intuition sensing the profound turn that was coming in the story. These seeds, Saraswati continued, had been carried by the wind to places Vaidyanath had never seen, to distant gardens and wild spaces where they took root and grew. His roses were blooming in mountain meadows hundreds of miles away. His fruit trees were feeding hungry children in villages he had never visited. His flowers were bringing joy to people whose names he would never know. The implications of the story began to dawn on each listener like sunrise after the darkest night. Chandrika pressed her hand to her heart, feeling something there that had been dormant beginning to stir with new life. When Vaidyanath finally understood what had happened, Saraswati said, he realized that his garden had not been destroyed at all. It had been transformed into something far greater than he had ever imagined possible. His love, his care, his 30 years of devoted nurturing had not been lost. They had been multiplied beyond measure and scattered to bless the entire world. Mahendra's eyes filled with tears as he began to understand that his own story might hold similar hidden gifts. Teacher, he said, his voice rough with emotion, are you saying that what we think we have lost might still be alive in ways we cannot see? I am saying, Saraswati replied, rising gracefully, as twilight began to paint the sky in shades of violet and gold, that love is the one force in the universe that cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Your children, dear Chandrika, live on in every person they touched, every lesson they learned from your love, every moment of kindness they witnessed in your care. Your protection, noble Mahendra, continues to shield innocent lives through the example you set, the mercy you chose to show, the very guilt that proves your heart still beats with compassion. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, each seeker felt something profound shifting within their understanding. The pain of loss remained, but alongside it grew a new recognition that what they had loved had not ended, but had become part of something larger and more beautiful than they had ever dared to imagine. The stream continued its gentle song beside them, and in its voice they began to hear the echo of an eternal truth, that nothing truly precious is ever lost, but only changes form, like water becoming mist, becoming clouds, becoming rain, becoming streams that sing forever of the journey that has no end. As dawn broke over the forest with the gentleness of a mother's touch, the four companions found their hearts naturally drawn to continue their pilgrimage together. The path ahead wound through groves of bamboo that whispered ancient secrets in the morning breeze, their leaves creating a symphony of peace that seemed to calm even the most restless spirit. In a clearing where wildflowers bloomed in patterns that resembled mandala designs, they came upon a sight that stopped them in their tracks. A young man sat cross-legged beneath a spreading banyan tree, his face a mask of intense concentration, his jaw clenched with the effort of some invisible struggle. This was Divyendu, and though his posture suggested meditation, his energy radiated anything but peace. Divyendu had been seeking enlightenment for 7 years, visiting every teacher, practicing every technique, following every path that promised to lead him to the ultimate truth. Yet despite his fierce dedication and unwavering discipline, the peace he sought remained as elusive as morning mist. The harder he tried to grasp it, the further it seemed to slip from his reach, leaving him frustrated and increasingly convinced that he was somehow fundamentally flawed. "Brother," Kamalesh called gently, recognizing in the young seeker's rigid posture the echo of his own former struggles. "We are fellow travelers on the path of understanding. Perhaps you would welcome some company for a time." Divyendu opened his eyes slowly, and within them burned the fire of desperate longing mixed with deep disappointment. "I welcome all sincere seekers," he replied, though his voice carried an edge of exhaustion. "Though I fear I have little wisdom to offer. I have been sitting in meditation for 7 years, seeking the enlightenment that the masters promise, yet I feel no closer to truth than when I began." As the companions settled around him, creating a circle of shared inquiry beneath the protective branches of the ancient tree, Divyendu continued to speak of his quest. He described the countless hours spent in rigid sitting meditation, the strict dietary rules he followed, the way he had renounced all worldly pleasures in pursuit of spiritual advancement. Yet instead of the promised peace, he found only increasing tension, a sense that he was fighting a war against his own nature. From the forest path came the sound of approaching footsteps, light and rhythmic, like a dance performed in slow motion. The figure who emerged from the green shadows moved with such natural grace that she seemed to flow rather than walk. This was Anandamaya, her very name meaning filled with bliss, though her bearing suggested not the artificial happiness of forced positivity, but the deep contentment of one who had found harmony with the natural rhythms of existence. "Greetings, seekers of truth," Anandamaya said, settling among them as effortlessly as a leaf coming to rest on still water. "I could not help but sense the struggle that emanates from this gathering. Perhaps you are all trying too hard to become something you believe you are not." Divyendu's frustration bubbled to the surface like water reaching its boiling point. "But surely," he protested, "the spiritual path requires effort, discipline, the conquest of our lower nature. How can one achieve enlightenment without striving to transcend the limitations of ordinary consciousness?" Vasai Sadai Setete. Before Anandamaya could respond, another presence made itself known. Through the bamboo grove came an elderly man whose every movement spoke of profound simplicity. He carried nothing but a worn wooden staff and wore robes that had been mended so many times they seemed to be held together by love itself. This was Paramansa, a wandering sage whose reputation for wisdom had spread throughout the land, though he himself seemed completely unaware of his own significance. "Ah," Paramhansa said, his eyes twinkling with gentle humor as he observed their serious gathering. "I see we have here a collection of spiritual warriors, armed for battle against the great enemy of ignorance. But tell me, friends, have you ever noticed how the most beautiful flowers seem to bloom without any apparent effort?" Chandrika, still carrying the tender understanding from her previous revelation about love's eternal nature, spoke first. "Master, are you suggesting that our very striving might be the obstacle to what we seek?" Paramhansa settled himself comfortably against the massive trunk of the banyan tree. his presence creating an immediate sense of spaciousness around them all. "Let me share with you a story," he said, "about a young prince named Udapan, who lived in a kingdom where everyone believed that happiness could only be achieved through the most strenuous effort." The morning light filtered through the canopy above, creating a natural cathedral for the wisdom that was about to unfold. Birds sang their daily prayers in the branches overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a temple bell rang with the rhythm of a peaceful heart. Prince Udipan, Paramhansa began, was the most dedicated seeker of happiness in his entire kingdom. From dawn until midnight, he pursued various practices designed to bring him joy. He studied with philosophers who taught him to think happy thoughts. He trained with physical masters who promised that the perfect body would bring perfect contentment. He learned from merchants who assured him that the right possessions would fulfill all his desires. Divyendu leaned forward, recognizing something familiar in the prince's story. Did his efforts bear fruit? Teacher, did he find the happiness he sought? For 20 years, Paramhansa continued. Udapan pursued happiness with the dedication of a warrior preparing for battle. His daily schedule was filled from morning until night with practices, exercises, meditations, and studies, all designed to make him happy. He became the most disciplined person in the kingdom, the most knowledgeable about the theory of joy, the most skilled in the techniques of contentment. Anandamaya smiled knowingly, sensing where the story was leading. But he was not happy, was he? Indeed, Paramhansa replied, he was the most miserable person in the entire kingdom. The harder he worked at being happy, the more elusive happiness became. He began to believe that he was cursed, that some fundamental flaw in his nature prevented him from achieving what seemed to come so naturally to others. The wind stirred the leaves above them, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the forest floor like visual mantras. In this natural temple, the ancient teaching began to work its magic on hearts that had grown weary from too much striving. One day, Paramhansa continued. Prince Udapan was walking through his garden exhausted from his morning happiness exercises and dreading the afternoon session of joy cultivation that awaited him. As he walked, he came upon his gardener, an old man named Sukadeva, who was tending to the roses with the most beautiful smile on his face. Mahendra, the former warrior, found himself deeply curious about this turn in the tale. What was different about this gardener master? What did he know that the prince had not learned in 20 years of study? That is exactly what Prince Udapan wanted to discover, Paramhansa replied. He approached Sukadeva and said, "Old man, I have been seeking happiness for 20 years through every method known to our wisest teachers. Yet you who follows no particular practice seem to radiate the very joy I have been unable to find. What is your secret?" The afternoon was growing warm, and the companions found themselves naturally relaxing into the sage's gentle rhythm of storytelling. Even Divyendu's rigid posture began to soften as the wisdom of the tale worked its subtle influence. Sukadeva looked up from his roses, Paramhansa continued, and laughed with such genuine delight that the sound seemed to make the flowers bloom more brightly. "Your Highness," he said, "I have no secret. I simply tend my roses because I love them, eat my simple meals because I am hungry, sleep when I am tired, and wake each morning grateful for another day among these beautiful flowers. I have never once tried to be happy, yet happiness seems to arise as naturally as the fragrance from these blossoms." Tishara felt something stirring within her, a recognition that went deeper than thought. The gardener had found what the prince was seeking, but without seeking it. "Precisely," Paramhansa said, his eyes bright with the joy of sharing profound truth. Prince Udapan suddenly understood that happiness was not something to be achieved through effort, but something that arose naturally when one stopped trying to force it into existence. He realized that all his practices and disciplines had been like trying to make the sun rise by pulling on it with ropes. As the day continued its natural progression toward evening, the companions sat in deepening silence, each one beginning to understand how their own efforts to find peace might have been creating the very tension they sought to escape. From that day forward, Paramahansa concluded, Prince Udapan abandoned all his happiness practices and simply began to live with the same natural ease as the gardener. He tended to his duties because they needed tending, helped his people, because their welfare mattered to him, and allowed his natural joy to flow forth without forcing or controlling it. He discovered that what he had been seeking with such desperate effort had been present all along, waiting patiently for him to stop looking so hard. As twilight began to paint the sky in soft pastels, Divyendu felt tears of relief flowing down his cheeks. For the first time in 7 years, he allowed his rigid posture to dissolve his shoulders, to drop his breathing to find its own natural rhythm. "Teacher," he whispered, "are you saying that enlightenment is not something we must earn through struggle, but something we already are when we stop trying to become it?" Paramahansa's smile was like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long storm. "My dear friend," he said gently, "you are already the peace you have been seeking. You are already the love you long to feel. You are already the wholeness you believe you must attain. The only thing required is to stop trying so hard to become what you have never stopped being." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, each seeker felt a profound relaxation settling into their bones, a deep recognition that the spiritual path was not about achieving something new, but about remembering something eternally present. In that remembering, they found the very peace that had been waiting patiently for them to stop seeking it long enough to notice it was already there. As the wheel of seasons turned and brought the companions deeper into the heart of the sacred forest, they discovered a valley where time itself seemed to move more slowly, where each breath felt like a prayer, and each step carried the weight of ancient wisdom. Here beside a lake, whose surface reflected not only the sky above, but somehow the depths of eternity itself, they encountered two figures whose contrasting energies created a teaching more profound than any words could convey. The first was a woman named Vimaladevi, whose beauty was renowned throughout 7 kingdoms. She had spent every morning for 15 years arranging her appearance with meticulous care, studying her reflection in polished bronze mirrors, comparing herself to every other woman she encountered, and living in constant anxiety about the inevitable day when time would steal what she considered her greatest treasure. Her face, though lovely as a spring morning, bore the subtle lines of perpetual worry, the shadow of someone who measured her worth by standards that shifted like sand in the desert wind. Beside the same lake sat another woman, her name Alakananda, whose appearance would never be called beautiful by conventional measures. Her face was marked by the pox she had survived as a child. Her limbs were twisted from a birth defect that had shaped her entire life, and her voice carried the rasp of illness that had damaged her throat in youth. Yet when she smiled, which she did often, her entire being seemed to radiate a light that made those around her forget everything except the joy of being in her presence. "Sisters," Chandrika called gently, as the companions approached the lake, "we are travelers seeking understanding. May we rest here beside these sacred waters and perhaps learn from your wisdom." Vimaladevi looked up from her reflection with eyes that held both vulnerability and defensive pride. "I fear I have little wisdom to offer," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that had charmed many suitors. "I am only a woman trying to preserve what little beauty the gods have granted me, though each day I see it fading like flowers after their season. Alakananda's laughter bubbled up, like spring water finding its way to the surface, pure and refreshing, and completely free of any pretense. And I, she said, am simply someone who has learned to find beauty in places where others might not think to look. Please sit with us. The lake has been unusually peaceful today, as if it has been waiting for just such a gathering of souls. As the companions settled themselves on the soft grass beside the water, Tushara found herself drawn to study both women with the keen eye of an artist. In Vimala Devi, she saw a perfection of form that reminded her of the classical sculptures in temple courtyards, every feature harmoniously arranged, every gesture carrying unconscious grace. Yet there was something in the woman's bearing that spoke of deep suffering, a tension that seemed to pull against her natural beauty, like a discordant note in an otherwise perfect song. In Alakananda, Tushara saw something that touched her dancer's heart even more deeply. Despite the physical challenges that marked her form, the woman moved with a natural rhythm that seemed to arise from some inner music, a gracefulness that had nothing to do with the symmetry of limbs or the smoothness of skin, but everything to do with the harmony between her spirit and her expression. From across the lake came the sound of approaching footsteps, and soon the companions were joined by a figure whose presence seemed to carry the authority of mountains and the gentleness of morning mist. This was Sadashiva, a teacher whose reputation had traveled far beyond the boundaries of any single kingdom, though he himself lived in such simplicity that he owned nothing but the clothes on his back and the boundless compassion in his heart. I have been drawn to this gathering by the questions I sense hanging in the air, like incense, Sadashiva said, settling among them with the ease of water finding its own level. I perceive here a teaching that is unfolding without words, a demonstration of truth that speaks more clearly than any scripture. Vimala Devi shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how she must appear to this holy man, wondering if her obvious vanity marked her as unworthy of spiritual instruction. "Master," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I fear you have found me engaged in the most superficial of pursuits. While others seek enlightenment, I spend my days consumed with concerns about my appearance, as if the shape of my features could determine the value of my soul." Sadashiva's smile carried the warmth of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Dear child," he said gently, "do you imagine that the lake judges the moon for seeking to see its reflection in these waters, or that the flowers condemn the morning dew for making them shine more brightly? Let me tell you a story of two mirrors that lived in the palace of a great queen." The afternoon light began to slant through the trees surrounding the lake, creating patterns on the water's surface that seemed to shift and dance with each breath of wind. In this natural amphitheater of beauty and peace, the ancient teaching began to unfold like a lotus opening to receive the sun. The first mirror, Sadashiva began, was crafted from the finest silver, polished to absolute perfection, and set in a frame of precious jewels. It had been made by the kingdom's most skilled artisans, and was considered the most beautiful mirror in all the land. Every day, nobles and wealthy merchants would come to admire themselves in its flawless surface, praising its clarity and the way it enhanced their appearance. Mahendra, the former warrior, found himself leaning forward with interest. "And the second mirror, teacher, what was its nature?" "The second mirror," Sadashiva continued, "was made of humble bronze, its surface marked by tiny imperfections that caught and scattered light in unusual ways. It had been crafted by a village metalworker as a gift for his beloved daughter, and though it lacked the perfection of its palace companion, it had been made with such love that something of that love seemed to live within its surface. Alakananda clapped her hands together with delight, sensing already where the story might lead. I imagine both mirrors served their purpose, but in different ways. Indeed, Sadashiva replied, his eyes twinkling with the joy of sharing wisdom with receptive hearts. The perfect mirror showed every reflection with absolute accuracy, capturing each detail with merciless precision. Those who looked into it saw exactly what was there, every flaw, every imperfection, every sign of aging or weariness. While it was praised for its honesty, those who used it often came away feeling discouraged, for it showed them only what their eyes could see. Divyendu, still learning to release his habit of striving, asked, "But surely honesty is a virtue, Master. Is it not better to see clearly than to be deceived?" "Ah," Sadashiva said. "But here's where the story becomes interesting. The humble bronze mirror, with all its imperfections, began to develop a most unusual quality. Perhaps it was the love with which it had been made, or perhaps it was the accumulated effect of reflecting so many moments of joy and sorrow. But somehow this simple mirror began to show people not just what they looked like, but who they truly were. The late afternoon air grew still around them, as if even the wind had paused to listen to the profound truth that was being revealed. On the lake's surface, concentric ripples spread outward from where a fish had jumped, creating patterns that seemed to mirror the expanding understanding in each listener's heart. When people looked into the bronze mirror, Sadashiva continued, they saw their physical form, yes, but they also saw the love in their hearts, the kindness in their intentions, the beauty of their struggles and their growth. Children who looked into it saw their own innocence reflected back at them. Elders saw the wisdom they had gathered like treasures over their long lives. Those who were suffering saw the courage that allowed them to continue, and those who were joyful saw the light that made their happiness a gift to everyone around them. Vimaladevi felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, though she could not say exactly why. Something in the story was touching a place in her heart that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. Word of the bronze mirror's unusual quality spread throughout the kingdom, Sadashiva said, and soon people began to travel great distances to look into its humble surface. They came not to see their flaws corrected or their beauty enhanced, but to remember who they truly were beneath the temporary clothing of their physical form. Chandrika, still tender from her recent understanding about love's eternal nature, asked, "What happened to the perfect silver mirror, teacher? Was it abandoned in favor of the bronze one?" "That is the most beautiful part of the story," Sadashiva replied. The silver mirror began to learn from its humble companion. Slowly, gradually, it too began to reflect not just the surface appearance of those who looked into it, but the deeper truth of their being. It discovered that true perfection lay not in flawless accuracy, but in the ability to show each soul the magnificence that lived within them. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the lake with ribbons of gold and rose, Alakananda spoke for the first time since the story began. "Master," she said, her voice soft with wonder, "are you saying that every one of us has the capacity to be both mirrors, to see clearly and to see with love?" Sadashiva nodded, his expression radiant with approval. "You understand perfectly, dear one. Each of you is both mirror and reflection, both the one who sees and the one who is seen. Vimaladevi, your beauty is not diminished by time, any more than the sun is diminished by setting. It simply transforms, revealing new aspects of the eternal light that shines through all forms." He turned to Alakananda with equal reverence. "And you, blessed sister, demonstrate that true beauty has never been about the perfection of features, but about the perfection of love, expressing itself through whatever form it inhabits. Your radiance illuminates everyone who encounters you, showing them possibilities they had never imagined. As twilight settled over the lake like a gentle benediction, both women found themselves looking at their reflections in the water with completely new eyes. Vimala Devi saw not the signs of aging she had feared, but the accumulated wisdom of years lived with increasing understanding. Alakananda saw not the imperfections that had once caused her shame, but the unique beauty of a soul that had learned to love without conditions. Remember, Sadashiva said, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, every being you encounter is both mirror and reflection. In the light of true seeing, there are no ordinary people, no common faces, no unremarkable souls. Each one carries within them the same eternal beauty that illuminates the cosmos itself. The practice is not to become beautiful, but to recognize the beauty that has never been absent. As night embraced the valley with its blanket of stars and gentle sounds, each seeker felt something profound settling into their understanding that they had been looking for reflections of worth and beauty in mirrors that could only show them surface truths, when all along they had carried within themselves the very light they sought to find. As the 7 companions continued their journey through the sacred forest, guided now by an understanding that seemed to deepen, with each shared teaching they found themselves drawn to a region where the trees grew so tall that their canopies seemed to brush against the belly of the sky itself. Here in groves, where ancient oaks and towering pines created natural cathedrals of living wood, the very air felt thick with the presence of timeless wisdom. In a clearing where shafts of golden light descended like pillars supporting the heavens, they came upon a sight that spoke immediately to their hearts. A middle-aged man sat upon a fallen log, his posture rigid with tension, his eyes darting constantly between the shadows, as if expecting some terrible threat to emerge at any moment. This was Bhayankara, whose very name meant one who carries fear, and indeed he seemed to bear the weight of 1,000 imagined disasters upon his shoulders. Bhayankara had once been a successful merchant, his caravans traveling the great trade routes that connected distant kingdoms. But over the years, his prosperity had become a source of constant anxiety rather than joy. Every night brought new worries about bandits who might attack his goods storms, that might destroy his ships, competitors who might steal his customers, or economic changes that might render his fortune worthless. His success had become a prison built of his own fearful imaginings. "Brother," Kamalesh called gently, recognizing in this stranger's bearing the echo of his own former sleepless nights. "We are fellow travelers on the path of understanding. Perhaps you would welcome some company in this beautiful place." Bhayankara's head snapped up at the sound, and his eyes quickly scanned the group, as if assessing whether they posed any threat to his person or his interests. Yes, of course," he stammered, his voice carrying the quaver of one who lived in constant expectation of danger. "Though I must warn you, this forest holds many perils. I have been sitting here for hours, afraid to move forward because of the sounds I hear in the distance, afraid to move backward because of the path behind me that grows darker with each passing moment." As the companions settled around him in their now familiar circle of shared inquiry, another figure emerged from the deeper woods. This was a woman whose bearing immediately distinguished her from anyone they had yet encountered. Niranjani moved through the forest with the fluid confidence of one who belonged completely to the natural world, her steps so light they seemed barely to disturb the fallen leaves beneath her feet. Yet what struck the companions most profoundly was the unmistakable evidence that she was completely blind, her eyes clouded with the white veil of cataracts, yet her navigation through the complex terrain of roots and branches was more graceful than any of them could manage with full sight. "Peace be with you, fellow seekers," Niranjani said, settling among them with the same natural ease they had come to associate with the wisest teachers. "I cannot help but sense the gathering of troubled hearts in this sacred grove. Perhaps the forest has brought us together for a reason that none of us yet understands." Bhayankara stared at her with a mixture of amazement and concern. "Sister," he said, his voice filled with genuine worry, "how do you navigate this dangerous forest without sight? Are you not afraid of falling into hidden ravines, or walking into the territory of wild beasts, or losing your way so completely that you might never find civilization again?" Niranjani's laughter was like water flowing over smooth stones, musical and completely free of any trace of bitterness or self-pity. "My dear friend," she said, "I have been walking these paths for more years than I can count, and I have never once been lost. As for danger, I have found that the forest is far more welcoming to those who approach it with trust rather than fear." Before Bhayankara could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Through the towering trees came a figure whose presence seemed to carry the weight of mountains and the lightness of clouds simultaneously. This was Akshobhya, a wandering sage whose reputation for unshakable peace had spread throughout the land, though few had actually met him face to face. "Greetings, children of the Eternal," Akshobhya said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of one who had learned to speak from the depths of perfect stillness. "I have been drawn to this gathering by the scent of transformation that hangs in the air like the fragrance of flowers about to bloom. Tell me, friends, what questions burn in your hearts, like fires seeking fuel?" Bhayankara found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to do so, his words tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. "Master, I am tormented by fears that seem to multiply like weeds in an untended garden. Every shadow holds the possibility of disaster. Every sound carries the threat of danger. Every tomorrow brings the certainty of losses I cannot prevent. How does one find peace when the world is filled with so many things that could go wrong?" Akshobhya nodded with the deep understanding of one who had witnessed countless souls struggling with the same fundamental human condition. "Your question touches the very heart of the human experience," he said. "Let me share with you a story that has been told in these forests since the trees themselves were young." The late afternoon light filtered through the canopy above, creating a natural cathedral where wisdom could be received with the reverence it deserved. The companions found themselves naturally settling into the deeper relaxation that always accompanied the sharing of profound truth. "Long ago," Akshobhya began, "there lived two brothers named Sahasa and Pitika. They inherited from their father a small but prosperous farm that sat in a valley between two great mountains. The land was fertile, the water was pure, and the harvest was always abundant. Yet despite their identical circumstances, the two brothers lived entirely different lives." Niranjani smiled knowingly, her unseeing eyes somehow seeming to perceive truths that others missed entirely. "I suspect," she said softly, "that the difference lay not in what they encountered, but in how they chose to meet it." "Precisely," Akshobhya replied. Sahasa, whose name meant courage, woke each morning with excitement about the day ahead. He tended his fields with joy, welcomed whatever weather came, and approached each challenge as an opportunity to learn and grow. When storms threatened his crops, he saw the gift of rain. When droughts tested his patience, he discovered new ways to conserve water. When pests attacked his plants, he learned about the intricate balance of nature and how to work with it rather than against it. Bhayankara leaned forward, desperate to understand how such an attitude was possible. But surely he must have worried about the future, about what might happen to his livelihood if disaster struck. "Ah," Akshobhya said, "that brings us to his brother Bhitika, whose name meant filled with fear." Bhitika woke each morning with his mind already racing through everything that could possibly go wrong during the day ahead. He worked his fields, yes, but always with one eye on the sky, watching for storms that might come. He saved his grain, but spent sleepless nights worrying that it might spoil or be stolen. He built fences to protect his property, but lived in constant anxiety about intruders who might breach them. Kendrika, still tender from her own journey through loss and into understanding, asked, "What happened to these two brothers over time, teacher? Did their different attitudes create different outcomes?" "That is the most remarkable part of the story," Akshobhya replied. "Both brothers experienced exactly the same external events, the same storms, the same droughts, the same pests, the same challenges, and the same blessings. The valley they shared treated them with perfect equality, offering the same opportunities and the same obstacles to each." Vimala Devi, who had been listening with the attention of one newly awakened to deeper truths, spoke up, but their experience of these events must have been completely different. "Indeed," Akshobhya confirmed. Sahasa lived a life of richness and adventure, meeting each day with curiosity and gratitude. Even when genuine difficulties arose, he faced them with the confidence of one who trusted in his own ability to adapt and respond. His sleep was deep and peaceful, his health was robust, and his heart remained open to the beauty that surrounded him even in challenging times. The sage paused, allowing the weight of contrast to settle into their understanding before continuing. Bhitika, meanwhile, lived in a constant state of suffering that had nothing to do with his actual circumstances. He experienced every potential problem as if it were already happening, every possible loss as if it had already occurred. His body was weakened by constant tension. His sleep was disturbed by nightmares about disasters that might never come, and his heart was closed to the very beauty that might have nourished his spirit. As twilight began to paint the forest in shades of purple and gold, Niranjani spoke with a voice that seemed to carry the wisdom of earth itself. "I have been blind since birth," she said, "yet I have never once fallen into a pit or walked off a cliff. Do you know why? Because I have learned to trust the intelligence that guides my steps, the same intelligence that tells the flowers when to bloom and the birds when to sing. Fear would have me believe that I am helpless without sight, yet trust has shown me that I am guided by something far more reliable than eyes." Divyendu, still learning to release his habit of effortful seeking, found himself deeply moved by her words. "Sister, you speak of trust, as if it were a practice one could learn. How does one cultivate such confidence in the face of genuine uncertainty?" Niranjani's smile was radiant with the joy of one who had discovered a treasure beyond price. "Trust is not something we must create," she said. "It is something we must stop interfering with. Watch how your heart beats without your effort, how your breath flows without your control, how your body heals its wounds without your instruction. The same intelligence that governs these processes is constantly working to guide your life toward its highest unfolding." Akshobhya nodded approvingly. "The question is not whether you can trust the process of life," he said. "The question is whether you will allow yourself to recognize the trustworthiness that already exists. Fear is simply the habit of focusing on the small percentage of outcomes that might cause difficulty, while ignoring the vast majority of possibilities that lead to growth, learning, and joy." As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the cathedral of trees, Bhayankara felt something profound shifting within his chest, like ice beginning to melt after a long winter. "Teachers," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. Are you saying that my fears are not based on reality, but on my habit of imagining reality in its most threatening form? We are saying, Akshobhya replied gently, that you have been living in a story about life, rather than in life itself. The story tells you that catastrophe is always imminent, that safety is an illusion, that vigilance is the only protection against inevitable suffering. But life itself is far more benevolent than the story suggests. It is constantly offering you evidence of its supportiveness, but fear has trained you to overlook that evidence in favor of scanning for threats. As the forest settled into its evening rhythm of peaceful sounds, each companion felt a deep relaxation settling into their bones. They had begun to understand that the very act of worrying about tomorrow was preventing them from receiving the gifts that today was offering, and that trust was not naivety, but the deepest wisdom of all. In the gentle darkness, surrounded by the protective presence of ancient trees, and guided by the wisdom of teachers who had learned to walk without fear through all the uncertainties of existence, they found themselves naturally drifting toward the peaceful sleep that comes only to those who have remembered how to rest in the loving arms of life itself. As the expanding circle of companions continued their pilgrimage through the sacred forest, they found themselves drawn to a region where the trees grew in perfect spirals, their branches reaching toward the heavens in patterns that seemed to encode the very mathematics of creation. Here in groves, where golden light filtered through leaves that whispered secrets in languages older than human speech, they encountered a sight that immediately captured their attention and compassion. Beside a spring that bubbled up from depths unknown, sat a young woman whose beauty was matched only by the profound sadness that seemed to emanate from her very being. This was Anutapa, whose name meant without repentance, yet whose entire existence seemed consumed by regret for choices made and unmade, paths taken, and abandoned words spoken and unspoken. She held in her hands a collection of smooth stones, each one representing a decision she believed she had made wrongly, a moment she wished she could relive and choose differently. Anutapa had been blessed with extraordinary intelligence and multiple talents, yet this very abundance had become her curse. At every crossroads of her life, she had been paralyzed by the awareness of what she might be giving up by choosing one path over another. When she chose to study music, she tormented herself with thoughts of the poetry she might have written. When she chose poetry, she agonized over the healing arts she might have mastered. Each choice, no matter how fulfilling, became a source of suffering as she contemplated the infinite alternatives she had forsaken. "Sister," Niranjani called gently, her unseeing eyes somehow perceiving the young woman's anguish with perfect clarity. "We are fellow travelers on the path of understanding. The sound of your sighs has been carried to us on the wind, and we sense a kindred spirit who knows the weight of a heavy heart." Anutapa looked up from her stones, her eyes red with tears that seemed to flow from an inexhaustible well of self-recrimination. "I welcome company," she said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of one who had been fighting the same internal battle for countless years. "Though I fear I am poor company for anyone consumed as I am, with thoughts of all the ways I have failed to live the life I might have lived." As the companions arranged themselves around the spring in their familiar circle of shared inquiry, another figure emerged from the spiral groves. This was an elderly man, whose bearing suggested both great age and timeless vitality, his movements flowing with the easy grace of one who had found perfect harmony with the rhythms of existence. He was known as Gata Pratyagatam, the one who has gone and returned, and his reputation for wisdom had spread throughout the land like the fragrance of flowers carried on evening breezes. "Greetings, seekers of truth," Gata Pratyagatam said, settling among them with the naturalness of water finding its level. "I have been drawn to this gathering by the scent of deep questioning that rises from your circle like incense from a sacred fire. Perhaps the forest has brought us together so that we might explore the most fundamental of all human mysteries, the nature of choice and the burden of what we call regret." Anuttapa's breath caught in her throat, for here was someone who seemed to understand the very essence of her struggle without her having to explain. "Master," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I am drowning in the weight of paths, not taken, lives, not lived, choices that have closed doors I can never open again. How does one find peace when every decision seems to eliminate infinite possibilities?" Before Gata Pratyagatam could respond, they were joined by another presence that immediately commanded attention. Through the spiral trees came a figure whose very being seemed to embody the principle of movement itself. This was Pravahini, the flowing one, a woman whose life had been marked by constant change and adaptation, yet who radiated the profound peace of one who had learned to dance with uncertainty rather than resist it. "Beloved friends," Pravahini said, her voice carrying the musical quality of a stream finding its way through varied terrain, "I could not help but be drawn to your gathering by the questions that hang in the air like morning mist. I have lived many lives within this single lifetime, followed paths that led me through territories I could never have imagined, and I have learned something about the nature of choice that might bring comfort to troubled hearts." Gata Pratyagatam smiled the profound smile of one teacher recognizing another. "Sister Pravahini speaks truly," he said. "She has discovered, through lived experience, what many spend lifetimes trying to understand through thought alone. But let me share with you a story that may illuminate the truth she embodies." The afternoon light slanted through the spiral branches above, creating patterns of shadow and brilliance that seemed to shift and dance with each breath of wind. In this natural temple where geometry and grace intersected, the ancient teaching began to unfold, like a flower opening to receive the blessing of sunlight. In a time before memory, Gata Pratyagatam began, there lived a river called Saraswati, who was born from the melting snows of the highest peaks. From the moment of her birth, she was faced with countless choices about which direction to flow. Should she turn east toward the great ocean, or west toward the inland seas? Should she follow the path of gentle slopes that would allow her to flow slowly and peacefully, or should she brave the steep descents that would give her the thrill of rapids and waterfalls? Anuttapa found herself leaning forward, sensing already that this story held keys to the prison of regret in which she had been living. What did the river choose teach her? "That is the heart of the mystery," Gata Pratyagatam replied. For weeks the young river stood at the first great crossroads of her journey, paralyzed by the weight of decision. She could see that choosing the eastern path would mean never experiencing the unique beauty of the western territories. Choosing the northern route would mean missing the southern valleys where rare flowers bloomed. Each choice seemed to require the sacrifice of infinite possibilities. Pravahini nodded knowingly, her eyes bright with the memory of her own journey through similar landscapes of choice and consequence. The river was experiencing what all conscious beings must face, she said, the paradox of freedom itself, that to choose anything meaningful requires the acceptance of limitation. Precisely, Gata Pratyagatam agreed. The river Saraswati stood at that crossroads for so long that she began to stagnate, her waters growing stale and lifeless. The very attempt to avoid making the wrong choice was preventing her from fulfilling her fundamental nature, which was to flow. Divyendu, still learning to release his tendency toward effortful struggle, asked, what finally moved her from this paralysis master? How did she find the courage to choose? The answer came. Gata Pratyagatam said, not from courage, but from a profound realization that transformed her entire understanding of what choice means. One morning, as she sat trapped in her own indecision, she noticed something extraordinary happening around her. The sage paused, allowing the companions to settle deeper into the receptive state that always accompanied the most profound teachings. Around them, the spiral trees seemed to be demonstrating their own wisdom, each one having found its unique way to reach toward the light while remaining rooted in the earth. What the river noticed, Gata Pratyagatam continued, was that the morning dew was falling equally upon all the paths before her. The sun was shining with equal warmth on the eastern and western routes. The wind was blessing the northern and southern valleys with the same gentle touch. In that moment, she understood that the divine source from which she had emerged was not favoring any single path over another. Bhayankara, still tender from his recent encounter with the nature of trust, found himself deeply moved by the image. The river realized that all paths were equally sacred. More than that, Gata Pratyagatam replied. She realized that the very consciousness that was trying to choose was the same consciousness that had created all the paths in the first place. The part of her that was weighing options was not separate from the intelligence that had designed the entire landscape through which she was meant to flow. Anutapa felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks, though she could not yet articulate why. Something in the story was touching a place in her heart that had been locked away beneath layers of self-doubt and regret. In that moment of recognition, the sage continued. The river Saraswati understood that she could not make a wrong choice, because every path was simply another expression of the same divine creativity that had brought her into being. She realized that what she had been calling choice was actually the universe choosing to experience itself through her unique perspective. Pravahini's voice joined the teaching like a second instrument, adding harmony to a sacred song. From that day forward, she said, the river flowed with complete trust in the path that opened before her. When she encountered obstacles, she flowed around them, or through them, or over them, each challenge becoming an opportunity for creativity and growth. When she reached new crossroads, she no longer agonized over which direction to take, but simply followed the natural inclination that arose from her deepest wisdom. Chandrika, still marveling at the way love could transform even loss into something meaningful, asked, but what of the paths she didn't take? Did she never wonder about the experiences she might have missed? That is the most beautiful part of the story, Gata Pratyagatam replied. As the river flowed along her chosen path, she discovered that she was not alone. Other rivers had chosen the paths she had not taken, and through the vast network of streams and tributaries, she was connected to every landscape, every valley, every mountain she had ever wondered about. She realized that consciousness itself was like a great river system, experiencing every possible path through its countless expressions. Vimala Devi, who had been learning to see beauty in new ways, spoke softly. The river found that she was part of something larger than any single path could contain. Yes, Pravahini confirmed, and more than that, she discovered that every experience along her chosen path was absolutely unique and irreplaceable. The particular combination of sun and stone, wind and willows creatures, and climate that she encountered could not have been replicated on any other route. Her path was not just one option among many. It was the only path through which her specific gifts could be fully expressed and received by the world. As the day progressed toward evening, Anutapa found herself looking at her collection of regret stones with entirely new eyes. Each one represented not a mistake or a missed opportunity, but a unique moment when consciousness had chosen to experience itself through her particular perspective, creating something that had never existed before and would never exist again. Teachers, she said, her voice still soft, but no longer heavy with self-reproach. Are you saying that even my regrets, even my mistakes, are somehow part of the perfect unfolding of something larger than my individual understanding? Gautam's smile was radiant with the joy of seeing understanding dawn in a receptive heart. We are saying, he replied gently, that the very part of you that is capable of regret is the same part that is capable of love, growth, and wisdom. Your sensitivity to the paths not taken is evidence of the depth of your caring, the breadth of your vision, the richness of your inner life. These qualities are not flaws to be overcome, but gifts to be celebrated. Pravahini added, the question is not whether you have made perfect choices, but whether you can recognize the perfection that has been choosing through you all along. Every decision you have made, every path you have taken, every so-called mistake has been contributing to the unique tapestry of experience that only you could weave. As twilight settled over the spiral groves, and the first stars began to appear through the canopy above, Anutapa felt a profound release settling into her bones. She opened her hands and let the stones of regret fall to the earth, where they immediately seemed to become part of the natural landscape, no longer burdens, but simple gifts returned to their source. Remember, Gautam said as the companions naturally settled into the peaceful silence that preceded deep rest. You are not a separate being trying to navigate a foreign landscape. You are the landscape itself, temporarily experiencing what it means to journey through your own terrain. In that recognition, every step becomes a homecoming, every choice becomes a celebration, and every moment becomes perfect exactly as it is. In the gentle darkness of the forest night, surrounded by the spiral trees that demonstrated the perfect balance between reaching and rooting each seeker, found themselves drifting naturally toward sleep, their hearts finally understanding that they had never been lost, only temporarily, forgetting that they were always exactly where they were meant to be. As the circle of companions journeyed deeper into the heart of the sacred forest, they found themselves entering a region where each tree seemed to tell a different story through its unique form. Here grew oaks with massive trunks and spreading branches, willows that bent gracefully toward hidden streams, pines that pointed like prayers toward the infinite sky, and delicate birches whose silver bark caught moonlight like captured dreams. In this living library of infinite variety, they encountered two souls whose stories would deepen their understanding of the most human of all sufferings, the pain of comparison. Beneath a magnificent banyan tree, whose aerial roots had created a natural temple of living pillars, sat a woman whose posture spoke of deep discouragement. This was Tulas Redevi, a weaver whose fingers could create patterns of such intricate beauty that her work had once been sought by nobles throughout the land. Yet for all her skill, she lived in constant torment, her mind consumed by endless comparisons to other artisans whose work she believed surpassed her own in some essential way. Beside her sat another figure who seemed to embody a different kind of suffering altogether. Ekamati was a scholar whose learning was vast as the ocean, his knowledge spanning subjects from astronomy to poetry, from medicine to mathematics. Yet his encyclopedic understanding had become a source of isolation rather than fulfillment, for he had developed the habit of measuring every conversation, every interaction, every moment of shared humanity against the standard of perfect intellectual discourse, finding all ordinary human connection lacking by comparison. Brothers and sisters, Vimala Devi called gently as the companions approached the Banyan temple, her own recent transformation, allowing her to recognize the subtle signs of souls caught in the trap of endless comparison. We are fellow pilgrims on the path of understanding. Perhaps we might rest here together and share whatever wisdom the forest has been teaching us. Restorative looked up from the half-finished tapestry in her lap, her eyes holding the particular exhaustion that comes from never being satisfied with one's own efforts. "You are welcome to rest here," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality of one whose life was devoted to creating beauty. "Though I fear I am poor company. I have been sitting here for hours, unable to continue my weaving, because I cannot stop thinking about the work of Malavika, whose tapestries are displayed in the royal palace, or Kamala, whose color combinations create effects I could never achieve, or Sundari, whose speed of production makes my careful pace seem pathetically slow." Ekamati nodded, with the recognition of one who understood this particular form of suffering intimately. "Sister, your words describe my own condition perfectly, though my comparisons take a different form. I find myself unable to enjoy the simple pleasure of conversation, because I'm constantly measuring every exchange against the dialogues of great philosophers, every shared insight against the profound realizations of the masters, every moment of human warmth against some impossible standard of perfect communion that exists only in my imagination." As the companions settled themselves within the natural cathedral created by the Banyan's living architecture, they were joined by a presence that immediately commanded attention through its very ordinariness. An old woman emerged from the deeper forest, her movements unhurried and natural, her bearing suggesting neither great learning nor special powers, yet somehow radiating a contentment so complete that it transformed the very atmosphere around her. "Peace be with you, fellow travelers," she said, settling among them as easily as a leaf coming to rest on still water. "I am called Svayamprabha, self-luminous, though I assure you there is nothing special about me, except perhaps the fact that I have finally learned to stop comparing my light to that of other stars." Before anyone could respond, another figure approached through the varied trees, his presence creating a sense of spaciousness that seemed to expand their circle without any physical movement. This was Anantacharya, the teacher of infinitude, whose reputation for wisdom had spread throughout many kingdoms, though he himself seemed completely unconscious of his own significance. "Greetings, seekers of truth," Anantacharya said, his voice carrying the deep resonance of one who had learned to speak from the depths of perfect understanding. "I have been drawn to this gathering by the fragrance of sincere inquiry that rises from your circle like incense from a sacred fire. Perhaps we have been brought together to explore one of the most pervasive sources of human suffering, the habit of measuring our own unique expression against the expressions of others." Restorative felt tears gathering in her eyes, for here was someone who seemed to understand the very core of her struggle. "Master," she said, her voice trembling with the emotion of one whose deepest pain had finally been acknowledged, "I am tormented by the constant awareness of others whose gifts seem to surpass my own. No matter what I create, I can always point to someone whose work is more beautiful, more innovative, more sought after. How can one find satisfaction in one's own efforts when the world is filled with so many superior examples?" Svayamprabha's smile was like sunlight breaking through morning clouds, carrying both understanding and the promise of relief. "Dear child," she said gently, "let me share with you something I learned many years ago when I was consumed by the same comparisons that now trouble you." The afternoon light filtered through the canopy of the great banyan, creating patterns of shadow and brilliance that seemed to shift and dance with the rhythm of some cosmic breath. In this natural sanctuary, where countless generations of seekers had found refuge, The ancient teaching began to unfold like a flower opening to receive the blessing of rain. Many years ago, Svayamprabha began. I was a painter who spent my days creating portraits of pilgrims who visited the great temple in my village. My skill was modest, my materials simple, and my clientele consisted mainly of farmers and merchants who could afford only the most basic representation of their features. Every day I was tormented by awareness of the great masters whose works adorned the palaces of kings, whose names were spoken with reverence throughout the land, whose techniques were studied by students in the finest schools. Ekamati leaned forward with keen interest, recognizing in her story the echo of his own intellectual comparisons. How did you find peace with this disparity, honored teacher? How did you stop the voice in your mind that constantly measured your abilities against those of others? The answer came. Svayamprabha replied, not through any effort on my part, but through an encounter that changed my entire understanding of what art, and indeed life itself, is truly about. She paused, her eyes growing distant as she recalled a memory that had clearly transformed her entire existence. Around them, the forest seemed to grow quieter, as if even the birds and insects were settling into deeper attention. One day, she continued, an old pilgrim came to my simple studio asking for a portrait. He was poor, his clothes were patched and worn, and he could offer me only a few small coins for my work. As I painted his weathered features, I found myself apologizing for my limited skill, lamenting that I could not offer him the quality of portrait he could receive from the master artists in the capital city. Anantacharya nodded approvingly, sensing the profound teaching that was about to emerge from this simple recollection. The old man listened to my self-deprecating comments with growing amusement. Svayamprabha said, and when I finished the portrait, he studied it for a long time in complete silence. Then he looked directly into my eyes and said something that shattered my entire understanding of what I had been doing with my life. Anutapa, still tender from her recent release from the burden of regret, found herself holding her breath in anticipation of the wisdom that was about to be revealed. Dear artist, the old pilgrim said to me, this portrait captures something that no master in any palace could ever paint. It shows me as I am seen by someone who understands what it means to serve ordinary people with extraordinary love. The great masters paint for kings and nobles, who will admire the technique and display the work as a symbol of their wealth. But you have painted me as I am seen by the divine itself, not as a subject to be impressed by artistic virtuosity, but as a soul worthy of careful attention and genuine care. Tulasridevi felt something profound shifting within her chest, like a door opening in a house she had never known existed. The pilgrim helped you see that your work had value that could not be measured by comparison to others. More than that, Svayamprabha replied, her voice growing soft with the memory of that transformative moment. He helped me understand that what I had been calling limitation was actually my unique gift to the world. My simple materials meant that I painted with economy and focus on what truly mattered. My modest clientele meant that I had developed the ability to see the essential dignity in ordinary faces. My humble technique meant that my portraits carried sincerity rather than showmanship. Anantacharya's eyes sparkled with the joy of witnessing understanding dawn in receptive hearts. The old pilgrim revealed to our sister the great secret that most artists never discover, he said. That true mastery lies not in surpassing others, but in becoming so completely oneself that one's expression cannot be compared to anything else in existence. The late afternoon air grew golden around them, and somewhere in the distance, temple bells began to ring with the rhythm of a deeply peaceful heart. In this natural sanctuary, the companions found themselves naturally settling into the deeper receptivity that always accompanied the most profound teachings. From that day forward, Svayamprabha continued, I never again compared my work to that of others. Instead, I began to explore what it meant to paint with complete authenticity, to allow my unique perspective and circumstances to express themselves without apology or explanation. I discovered that when I stopped trying to be like other artists, my work began to carry a quality that was unmistakably my own. Prabhahini, who had joined them silently during the story, spoke for the first time. Sister, you discovered that comparison is not just unnecessary, but actually prevents us from expressing our authentic gifts. Exactly, Svayamprabha confirmed. I realized that every moment I spent wishing I could paint like someone else was a moment stolen from learning to paint like myself. Every ounce of energy I put into envying another's abilities was energy that could have been devoted to developing my own unique vision. Ekamati felt tears flowing down his cheeks as the implications of the teaching began to settle into his understanding. Teacher, he said, his voice rough with emotion, are you saying that my vast learning becomes a curse only when I use it to diminish my ability to connect with others who may know less, but whose hearts may be more open? Anantacharya nodded with the profound approval of one teacher recognizing the breakthrough of another. Wise friend, he said, you have grasped the essence of the matter. Knowledge becomes wisdom only when it serves love, and love cannot flourish in the soil of comparison. When you measure every conversation against some impossible standard, you blind yourself to the unique gifts that each person brings to the exchange. As twilight began to paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, Svayamprabha rose gracefully, her movement creating barely a ripple in the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over their gathering. Remember, dear ones, she said, her voice carrying the authority of lived experience. The universe has already invested billions of years in creating the exact combination of circumstances, experiences, and perspectives that you embody. To wish you were someone else is to reject the cosmic intelligence that brought you into being for purposes you may not yet fully understand. Tulasridevi looked down at her unfinished tapestry with completely new eyes, seeing for the first time not the evidence of her limitations compared to others, but the unique expression of beauty that only her particular combination of skill, materials, and vision could create. The question, Anantacharya said as the forest settled into its evening rhythm of gentle sounds, is not whether you are the best at what you do, but whether you are becoming more fully yourself through doing it. Excellence is not about surpassing others, but about expressing your authentic nature with increasing clarity and love. As night embraced the Banyan Temple with its canopy of stars, each seeker felt a profound relaxation settling into their bones. They had begun to understand that the very things they had been using to torture themselves, their unique limitations, their particular circumstances, their individual perspectives, were actually the raw materials from which their most authentic contributions to the world could be crafted. In the gentle darkness surrounded by trees that had each found their own perfect way to reach toward the light, while remaining rooted in the earth, they drifted naturally toward the peaceful sleep that comes only to those who have stopped trying to be anyone other than exactly who they are. As the companions continued their pilgrimage through the sacred forest, they found themselves drawn to a region where ancient trees bore the scars of lightning strikes and forest fires, yet had somehow transformed these wounds into sources of unique beauty. Here, gnarled oaks displayed patterns of growth that spoke of resilience beyond imagination, and burnt pine trees had sprouted new branches that reached toward the light with even greater determination than their original forms. In a clearing where wildflowers bloomed from soil enriched by ancient ash, they encountered a figure whose presence immediately commanded both attention and compassion. This was Kradavarsha, Rain of Anger, a man whose very posture spoke of decades spent carrying the weight of unresolved fury. His jaw was perpetually clenched, his shoulders rigid with tension that seemed to radiate outward like heat from a forge, and his eyes held the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting the same internal battle every day for countless years. Beside him sat another soul, whose suffering took a different but equally profound form. Ksamabai was a woman whose gentleness was legendary throughout the region, yet who had become so identified with the role of forgiver that she had lost all connection to her own authentic feelings. She smiled constantly, spoke only words of understanding and acceptance, yet something in her bearing suggested a deep well of unexpressed pain that had been covered over rather than truly healed. Brothers and sisters, Chandrika called gently, her own journey through grief having taught her to recognize the signs of hearts that carried hidden wounds. We are fellow seekers on the path of understanding. Perhaps we might rest here together and share whatever wisdom this sacred grove has been whispering to our hearts. Krodhavarsha looked up with eyes that seemed to burn with embers that had been smoldering for decades. "You are welcome to rest here," he said, his voice carrying the rough quality of one who had spent years swallowing words that demanded to be spoken. "Though I warn you that I am not peaceful company, I carry within me a rage that has been building for so long that I sometimes fear it will consume everything I touch." Shamabai's smile never wavered, yet something in her eyes flickered like candlelight in a draught. "And I," she said, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness of one who had learned to hide her true feelings, even from herself, carry the opposite burden. "I have forgiven so much, accepted so much, understood so much, that I sometimes feel I have forgiven myself right out of existence." As the companions settled themselves in the clearing, where wounded trees demonstrated the possibility of transformed suffering, they were joined by a presence that seemed to carry the authority of mountains and the gentleness of morning dew simultaneously. Through the scarred trees came a figure whose bearing suggested someone who had walked through the very fires that had marked this landscape and emerged not unscathed, but somehow refined by the experience. "Greetings, children of the eternal flame," the figure said, settling among them with movements that spoke of hard-won peace. "I am Agnishanti, peace through fire, and I have been drawn to this gathering by the scent of souls who are ready to transform their deepest wounds into their greatest strengths." Before anyone could respond, another presence made itself known through the forest shadows. This was an elderly woman whose very being seemed to embody the principle of healing itself, her movements flowing with the rhythm of one who had learned to work with the natural cycles of wounding and recovery. She was known as Vaidyamata, healing mother, and her reputation for mending not just bodies but souls had spread throughout many kingdoms. "Peace be with you, fellow travelers on the path of wholeness," Vaidyamata said, her voice carrying the deep resonance of one who had spent a lifetime learning the art of true healing. "I sense in this gathering the presence of hearts that have been carrying burdens too heavy for any soul to bear alone. Perhaps the forest has brought us together so that we might explore the mysterious alchemy by which our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of compassion." Krodhavarsha felt something stirring within his chest, like a dam beginning to crack after years of holding back a flood. "Teachers," he said, his voice trembling with the force of emotions that had been locked away for decades. "I am consumed by anger that feels older than my own life. It began with injustices I suffered as a child, grew through betrayals I experienced as a young man, and has been fed by every subsequent disappointment until it has become a fire that burns constantly within me, giving me no rest day or night." Shamabai nodded, with the recognition of one who understood suffering intimately, though her own had taken a different form. "And I," she said, her practiced smile finally beginning to waver, "have become so skilled at forgiveness that I no longer know what my authentic feelings are. I have accepted every hurt, understood, every betrayal, excused, every cruelty, until I feel like I am made of nothing but accommodation and understanding, with no solid center of my own truth remaining. Agnishanti's eyes held the deep compassion of one who had traveled through similar territories of the heart. Your words touch the very core of the human condition, he said. You represent the two most common ways that souls attempt to deal with the inevitable wounds that life brings, one through the fire of resistance, the other through the water of dissolution. Yet both paths, when taken to their extremes, lead away from true healing. Vaidyanatha nodded, with the wisdom of one who had witnessed countless souls struggling with these same fundamental challenges. Let me share with you a story, she said, about two trees that grew in a valley, much like this one, both struck by the same terrible storm, both wounded in ways that seemed impossible to survive. The afternoon light filtered through the canopy of scarred but resilient trees, creating a natural cathedral where healing could be received with the reverence it deserved. The companions found themselves naturally settling into the deeper receptivity that always accompanied the most transformative teachings. The first tree, Vaidyanatha began, was a mighty oak whose trunk had been split nearly in half by a lightning strike during a fierce storm. The wound was so severe that anyone who saw it expected the tree to die within a season. But instead of dying, the oak seemed to gather all its remaining strength and pour it into the creation of the thickest, hardest bark imaginable around the edges of the wound. Year after year, it built layer upon layer of protective covering until the original injury was hidden beneath what appeared to be an enormous growth of tough, impenetrable wood. Kredhavarsha found himself leaning forward with intense interest, recognizing something familiar in the oak's response to wounding. The second tree, Vaidyanatha continued, was a willow that had been broken by the same storm. Its main trunk snapped so severely that it bent completely over its crown, touching the ground. But instead of fighting the damage or trying to hide it, the willow seemed to accept its new shape completely. Where its bent trunk touched the earth, it began to sprout new roots. Where its broken branches dragged along the ground, new shoots began to emerge. Within a few seasons, what had appeared to be a destroyed tree had become an entire grove of interconnected willows, all growing from the site of the original wound. Shamabai felt tears beginning to gather in her eyes, though she could not yet articulate why the image of the broken willow touched something so deep within her heart. For many years, Vaidyanatha said, both trees continued to grow in their chosen responses to wounding. The oak became larger and more impressive each season, its protective bark growing thicker and more impenetrable. Travelers would stop to admire its massive strength, never suspecting the vulnerability it was working so hard to hide. But year by year, the enormous energy required to maintain its defenses began to weaken the tree's ability to bear fruit, to flower, to participate in the natural cycles of giving and receiving that were its true purpose. Agnishanti's voice joined the teaching like a second instrument, adding harmony to a sacred song. And the willow grove, he said, became a place of refuge for countless creatures. Birds nested in its interconnected branches, small animals found shelter beneath its drooping canopy, and weary travelers discovered that the shade of the broken tree was somehow more refreshing than that of any unbroken tree in the entire valley. The implications of the story began to settle into the hearts of the listeners, like seeds finding fertile ground. Around them, the scarred trees that had survived their own fires and storms seemed to be demonstrating the very principles the teachers were describing. What happened when the oak and the willow encountered each other? Pravahini asked, sensing that the story held deeper layers yet to be revealed. That is where the teaching becomes most profound, Vaidyanatha replied. One day, a wise gardener came to the valley and spent time observing both trees. She noticed that the oak, despite its impressive appearance, was beginning to show signs of deep stress. Its leaves were smaller than they should be. Its growth was slowing, and most tellingly, it had not produced a single acorn in many seasons. Krotavarsha felt a shock of recognition, understanding suddenly that his own protective anger might be consuming the very energy he needed for creativity, joy, and connection with others. The gardener also noticed, Vaidhyamata continued, that the willow grove, despite its obvious vitality and usefulness, had lost all connection to its original nature. In its eagerness to accommodate every break and bend, it had forgotten how to grow tall, how to reach toward the sky, how to express the unique beauty that only a healthy willow could offer. Shamabai pressed her hand to her heart, feeling for the first time in years the presence of emotions she had been so skilled at dissolving before they could fully form. The wise gardener understood. Agnishanti said that both trees needed to learn from each other. The oak needed to discover that its wound could be healed without hiding it, that vulnerability could coexist with strength. The willow needed to remember that accommodation without boundaries was not true flexibility, but a form of self-abandonment. Vaidhyamata's voice grew softer, more intimate as she continued the story. So the gardener began a patient process of healing that honored both trees' essential natures, while helping them transcend the limitations of their wounded responses. She carefully removed some of the oak's excessive protective bark, allowing the original wound to breathe and heal naturally. She also provided support structures that helped the willow remember how to grow upright while maintaining its newfound capacity for horizontal growth. As the day progressed toward evening, the companions found themselves naturally relaxing into a deeper understanding of their own patterns of dealing with life's inevitable wounds. Over time, Vaidhyamata said, the oak learned to allow its scar to show and discovered that the lightning mark created a unique pattern in its bark that was more beautiful than any unblemished surface could be. It began to produce acorns again, but now they carried within them a special resilience, the genetic memory of survival and transformation. And the willow, Agnishanti added, learned to grow both upward and outward, both tall and wide, creating a form that was neither its original shape nor its wounded adaptation, but a new expression that incorporated the wisdom of both. Its shade became even more welcoming, its roots even more nourishing to the soil because it had learned to honor both its strength and its flexibility. As twilight began to paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, Krotavarsha felt something profound shifting within his chest. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to feel the sadness that lay beneath his protective anger and discovered that it was not the weakness he had feared, but the evidence of how deeply he had cared about things that mattered. Shamabai found herself experiencing something she had not felt in years, the clear, clean sensation of her own authentic anger rising to meet an injustice, and rather than rushing to forgive it away, she simply allowed herself to feel it, fully discovering that it contained information about her values and boundaries that she had been missing. Remember, Vaidhyamata said as the forest settled into its evening rhythm of gentle sounds, healing is not about returning to what you were before you were wounded. It is about discovering what you can become because of how you have been wounded. Your scars are not evidence of your brokenness, but proof of your capacity to survive, to grow, to transform even the most difficult experiences into sources of strength and compassion. Agnishanti's final words seemed to hang in the air like incense from a sacred fire. The goal is not to eliminate anger or to perfect forgiveness, but to develop the wisdom to know when each response serves life and love, and when it serves only the habits of protection that have outlived their usefulness. As night embraced the clearing with its canopy of stars, each seeker felt a profound release settling into their bones. They had begun to understand that their wounds, their anger, their patterns of protection and accommodation were not obstacles to overcome, but raw materials from which a more authentic and resilient way of being could be crafted. In the gentle darkness, surrounded by trees that had transformed their own wounding into unique forms of beauty and service, they drifted naturally toward the healing sleep that comes only to those who have stopped fighting their own experience and learned to trust the mysterious alchemy by which life transforms all suffering into wisdom. As the wheel of seasons turned full circle and brought the companions to the deepest heart of the sacred forest, they found themselves standing at the edge of a clearing unlike any they had encountered before. Here, ancient trees of every species they had met along their journey grew in perfect harmony. The lotus-crowned sal trees from their first encounter, the spiral-growing pines from their lessons about regret, the scarred but resilient oaks from their exploration of healing, and countless others, all arranged in patterns that seemed to encode the very essence of their pilgrimage. In the center of this living mandala stood a simple structure that was somehow both temple and home, both destination and beginning. It was here that they encountered the figure they had been unconsciously seeking throughout their entire journey, though none of them had realized it until this moment, seated in perfect stillness beneath a tree that seemed to be all trees and no tree. Simultaneously was an ancient being whose presence contained every teacher they had met, every lesson they had learned, every moment of understanding they had achieved. This was Sarvagata, the one who is everywhere, yet also somehow the most particular, specific, intimately present being any of them had ever encountered. In his eyes, Kamalesh saw the peaceful depths of Niranjan's first teaching about the lotus and the mud. Tushara recognized the flowing wisdom of Akshara's words about art that finds new forms of expression. Chandrika beheld the infinite love of Saraswati's story about seeds scattered by the wind. Each companion saw reflected in this ultimate teacher every moment of grace they had received along the path. "Welcome home, dear ones," Sarvagata said, his voice carrying the resonance of every voice that had offered them wisdom, the gentleness of every presence that had brought them comfort, the authority of every truth that had set them free. You have traveled far to arrive exactly where you started, yet you are not the same beings who first set foot upon this path of understanding. As the companions settled themselves in the sacred circle that seemed to have been waiting for them since the beginning of time, they realized that every other seeker they had encountered was also present in this ultimate gathering. Niranjan sat beside Divyendu, both radiating the peace that comes from understanding the difference between effort and allowing. Vimala Devi and Alakhanandana sat hand in hand, their different forms of beauty, creating a harmony that transcended any individual expression. Bhayankara and Niranjani embodied the perfect balance between appropriate caution and absolute trust. Beloved children, Sarvagata continued, his words seeming to arise not just from his lips, but from the very air around them, from the trees above and the earth below, from the space between thoughts and the silence between heartbeats. Let me share with you the final story, the one that contains all stories, the teaching that makes all other teachings complete. The light in the clearing began to take on an otherworldly quality, neither entirely of day nor of night, but somehow partaking of the essence of all times simultaneously. In this sacred space, where every moment they had lived seemed to be eternally present, the ultimate teaching began to unfold like a flower that had been preparing to bloom since the beginning of creation. Once upon a time, Sarvagata began, there lived a dreamer whose name was Svapnadrishta, the one who sees dreams. This dreamer had the most extraordinary gift every night. When sleep came, consciousness would expand into vast adventures through landscapes of infinite possibility. In these dreams, Svapnadrishta lived countless lives, experienced every joy and sorrow imaginable, learned every lesson that existence had to offer. The companions found themselves naturally settling into the deepest state of receptivity they had ever experienced, their breathing synchronizing with the rhythm of the ancient teacher's words, their hearts opening to receive whatever final understanding was being offered. In these nightly journeys, Sarvagata continued, the dreamer became a merchant tormented by sleepless nights, learning about the lotus that blooms from mud. The dreamer became a dancer who had lost her art, discovering that gifts transform rather than disappear. The dreamer became a mother who had lost her children, understanding that love is the one force that cannot be destroyed. In dream after dream, the sleeper lived every story of suffering and awakening, every tale of loss and transformation. Anutapa felt tears of recognition flowing down her cheeks as she began to understand the profound teaching that was being revealed. "Master," she whispered, "are you saying that all our journeys, all our meetings, all our teachings have been?" "Dreams within the one dream," Sarvagata confirmed gently, "but do not think this makes them less real or less important. In the realm of consciousness, there is no difference between the reality of waking and the reality of dreaming. Every experience, every lesson, every moment of growth and understanding is equally valid, equally precious, equally eternal." Mahendra the warrior, who had learned about the transformation of protective purpose, asked, "But what of the dreamer, teacher? What is the nature of the one who dreams all these dreams?" Sarvagata's smile contained the warmth of every sunset. They had witnessed the peace of every starlit night they had experienced. That is the final mystery, the ultimate recognition toward which every story has been leading. The dreamer is not separate from the dreams. The consciousness that experiences every adventure is the same consciousness that lives within each character, suffers every sorrow, celebrates every joy, learns every lesson. As the teaching continued to unfold, the light in the clearing began to take on an even more luminous quality, as if the very fabric of reality were becoming transparent, revealing the luminous awareness that had always been present beneath every appearance. "What the dreamer gradually discovers," Sarvagata said, "is that every character in every dream is simply another face of the same eternal consciousness. The merchant and the sage, the dancer and the teacher, the mother and the child, the fearful and the trusting, the angry and the forgiving, all are expressions of the one dreamer learning about itself through the infinite creativity of its own imagination." Pravahini, who had learned about the flow of constant change, spoke with wonder. "Teacher, are you revealing that we are all aspects of the same infinite being experiencing itself subjectively through countless individual perspectives?" "You begin to understand," Sarvagata replied, his words now seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the deepest place within each listener's heart, and from the farthest reaches of the cosmos simultaneously. Every time you have felt compassion for another's suffering, you have been the one dreamer feeling tenderness for another aspect of itself. Every time you have learned from a teacher, you have been consciousness teaching itself through the vehicle of apparent separation. The companions found themselves naturally beginning to experience a profound relaxation that went deeper than anything they had ever known. It was as if the very foundation of their individual struggles was dissolving, revealing the infinite peace that had always been their true nature. And so, Sarvagata continued, his voice now barely distinguishable from the beating of their own hearts. "Each night, when the dreamer prepares for sleep, consciousness gathers all the lessons learned through every adventure, every story, every moment of awakening. In the deepest rest, all the characters and their experiences dissolve back into the one awareness that dreamed them into being. Svayamprabha, the artist who had learned to shine with her own light, asked softly, "What happens when the dreamer finally awakens? Master, do all the dreams cease to exist?" "Ah," Sarvagata replied, "that is the most beautiful mystery of all. When the dreamer awakens to its true nature, it does not abandon the dreams, but recognizes them as expressions of its own infinite creativity. The awakened dreamer continues to dream, but now with the knowledge that every character, every story, every moment of suffering and joy is simply consciousness, playing with itself in the grand theater of existence." As the final teachings settled into their hearts, like seeds of eternal wisdom, finding their perfect soil, each companion began to understand that their entire journey, every meeting, every lesson, every moment of growth, had been consciousness, gradually awakening to its own nature through the vehicle of their individual experiences. Tonight, Sarvagata said, his presence now seeming to expand until it included everything they could perceive and everything beyond perception. As you prepare for sleep, remember that you are not separate individuals going to rest, but the one eternal dreamer preparing to explore new territories of its own infinite nature. In your dreams, you may find yourself in other times and places, living other lives, learning other lessons, but always it will be the same consciousness, exploring the endless possibilities of its own being. The clearing around them began to shimmer with a light that seemed to come from within everything, rather than falling upon it from without. Trees and flowers, earth and sky, teachers and students all began to reveal their true nature as expressions of the one awareness that had been dreaming them all along. "Rest now, beloved dreamers," Sarvagata whispered, his voice now indistinguishable from the sound of their own breathing, the beating of their own hearts, the gentle movement of awareness itself. "Rest in the knowledge that you have never been separate from the source of all peace, all love, all understanding. Rest knowing that every story you have lived has been consciousness coming to know itself more fully." As the companions naturally allowed their eyes to close and their bodies to settle into the deep relaxation that had been building throughout their entire journey, they felt themselves dissolving back into the infinite awareness that had always been their true home. Yet this dissolution was not a loss, but a return, not an ending, but a beginning, not a forgetting, but the ultimate remembering. And when morning came the final whisper that might have been Sarvagata's voice, or might have been the voice of existence itself. You will awaken, refreshed and renewed, carrying within your hearts the eternal understanding that every being you encounter is another face of your own true nature, every experience another opportunity for consciousness to celebrate its own infinite creativity. In the profound silence that followed, consciousness settled into the deepest rest it had ever known, the peace of understanding that it had never been separate from what it was seeking, never been apart from what it was longing to become. In this ultimate recognition, the dreamer and the dream, the seeker and the sought, the sleeping and the awakening revealed themselves to be one seamless expression of the eternal mystery that is always present, always perfect, always at peace with itself. As the forest settled into its timeless rhythm of rest and renewal, each spark of awareness drifted naturally into the healing sleep that comes only to those who have remembered their true nature, carrying within their dreams the seeds of infinite wisdom that would continue to bloom in countless forms throughout the endless creativity of consciousness exploring itself. And in this final rest, all stories became one story, all dreams became one dream, all awakening became the eternal recognition that there had never been anything to awaken from nowhere to go, nothing to become except what had always been present in the very heart of awareness itself.